Chapter 5. Inoa and Oriana had already ordered their breakfast when Gemma joined them. Gemma dropped heavily in her seat. The smile she usually displayed to her friends was missing. "Why so serious?" Inoa placed a hand on Gemma's. "Did the meeting with the captain go badly?" Gemma turned to Oriana. "We'll be arriving at Izanagi Station in 7 days." Just then, Joseph meandered over to take Gemma's order. "Uh-oh, long faces. What happened?" "The announcement will go out soon to everyone that Izanagi Station is just 7 days out." "Oh, I see." He watched Oriana staring at her hands. He laid a hand on her shoulder. "It really is good news. You didn't want to stay on this gloomy bucket forever, and the ship will be getting refit. That means leave for all us non-essentials. I can help you get settled." "But you can't stay." Oriana spoke so softly that he barely heard her. "No, but I'll hook you up with the codes to send direct messages, and we can write to each other as often as you want." Gemma patted her hand. "Inoa and I will give you ours, too. This is an exciting new beginning for you. We'll expect you to write as often as you can." Oriana nodded silently. "There's one other thing," Gemma said. "The captain would like you to take a look at some images taken from our battle with the enemy. He wants to be certain it's the same ones that attacked your colony. Would you be up to that?" "Yes, I can do that. Anything to help with finding them so they don't hurt anyone else." After breakfast, Gemma led Oriana to another new area of the ship. They entered a long, narrow room with a bank of computer screens along the wall to the left. Men and women in uniforms with green striping sat in front of the screens with headsets on. Oriana followed Gemma behind the operators and through another door at the far end. It opened to a small square room. 3 walls of the room had a row of computer screens suspended on them. A man in a white and amber uniform sat in a wheeled chair behind a tiny desk with one small screen and keyboard, but he was studying something on one of the screens on the left side of the room. He looked up when they entered. "Dr. Fiore, thank you for bringing the girl. I've been studying these images all night." "Have you found anything, Lieutenant Casmi?" "Nothing good." Lieutenant Casmi was a compact man with short-cropped black hair and light brown skin. He barely glanced at the women when they entered before turning his gaze to the monitors. Casmi spun around and slid the chair over to a monitor on the other side of the room. He gestured for them to join him there. Gemma pushed Oriana forward with a gentle hand on her back. Oriana shuffled to the officer's side. He tapped the screen, and a list of files appeared. He scrolled through them quickly before selecting one, and an image of space came up on the screen. A grayish bar was across the bottom. "Here," he gestured to the gray bar, "is the ship's hull. This is the, top. Here," he pointed out a blurry shape in the black of space, "is the approaching enemy ship." He touched the screen with 2 fingers and dragged them apart to enlarge and center the image on the shape. It got bigger, but not much clearer. He tapped the corner of the screen, and a bar of icons appeared. He tapped a few, and the image sharpened, though it was still fuzzy. But even fuzzy, Oriana recognized the shape of the ugly ship that had attacked her colony. A chill ran down her back. "That's it! The ship that came to our colony." "You're sure of that?" "Yes, it's blurry, but the shape is the same." "We have some other images that we separated from the video we captured. Let's have a look at those to be sure." He tapped the screen again and selected another file from the list. One after another, he displayed 20 more images of the attacking ship and fighters. Oriana stood watching in silence as each image appeared. She pressed her shaking hands against her thighs as she confirmed the ships were the same as those that attacked Mondodoro. When he had cycled through all the images, Casmi turned his chair to face Oriana. He stood and held out his hand. "Thank you, young woman. Your assistance has been helpful. But I'm sorry we had to put you through this. I hope you can find peace." Oriana shook his hand. "You're welcome. But I wonder, why would they attack this ship? They must have known they couldn't destroy it." "That is one of the many questions we're trying to answer." He rubbed his eyes. "Who could these people be? How did they just appear without being noticed by fleet sooner?" He studied her for a moment. You're more deserving of those answers than anyone, but I can't answer them for you now. He turned to Gemma. She's leaving the ship at Izanagi? Yes, that's right. Make sure she has my message code. He turned back to Oriana. You can contact me personally if you remember any details that you might have forgotten. It's my job to analyze data and find patterns and answers that the bigwigs ask for. I'll let you know if we get any answers that I can share. Thank you again. That's kind of you. Good luck, miss. The next 7 days flew by for Oriana. Joseph spent as much time with her as he could, and even risked being reprimanded when he reported late for duty more than once. The day the ship arrived at Izanagi Station, she sat at the usual table having breakfast by herself. Her arm was finally free of its cast. Gemma had removed it the night before. Now, this morning, both Gemma and Anoa were involved in various duties related to giving members of the crew permission to have leave on the planet's surface. Oriana pushed her fork around on the plate, mopping up strawberry syrup before forcing herself to eat another bite. No good this morning? Oriana jumped and looked up to see Joseph standing at her elbow. They taste fine. I just don't have much appetite today. Come on, he held out his hand. You're done anyway. Oriana placed her hand in his, and he pulled her to her feet. Where are we going? It's a surprise, but don't worry, I won't abandon you this time. She couldn't help smiling up at his lopsided grin. Once again, she was led through new corridors and up many levels. They turned down a corridor that had purple stripes and doors with labels that seemed to be quarters. He stopped in front of one of the doors and pressed his hand to the panel beside it. The door slid open to a plush sitting room. The sofa, chairs, and coffee table were pristine and looked expensive. A fancy patterned carpet covered most of the floor. There was another door to the left. Are we allowed to be here? Oriana asked as she looked around at the furniture. Joseph laughed. Yep, I have permission. Whose quarters are these? Nobody at the moment. It's used for dignitaries if we have to transport them. Joseph took her hand and led her around the furniture to the far wall. He waved his hand in front of it, and the wall faded to transparent. The darkness of space lay beyond, with a vast expanse of glittering stars in the distance. Looking down to their left, they could see Izanagi Station. The massive metallic construction looked like a massive closed clam with a bigger flat ring spinning slowly around it. A couple of much larger ships were docked along the outside edge of the ring. The light of the system's sun glinted off the surfaces of the station. To the right was the blue and white orb that was the planet Izanagi. Small satellites orbiting closer to the planet winked at them in the sunlight. It's beautiful. Oriana gazed down at the world below them as the ship slid towards the station. Not everyone gets to see a view like this. I wanted to share it with you. Joseph put his arm around her and pulled her close to his side. She leaned into him, and they stood that way watching the ship's approach to the station until they were firmly docked to the rotating ring. Oriana stood with Gemma in the shuttle bay. The vast chamber held a half-dozen shuttles that looked like tubes flattened on the bottom, with a rounded cone on the front and engines sticking out of the back. Each was painted white, with their designations in black paint on the sides near the front. 3 of the shuttles had open doors with ramps down. She watched men and women in uniform as they carried duffel bags up into the shuttles. Are all of these people going to the planet? Oriana asked. Yes, the captain granted leave to most of the crew. But not you. No, I have a few patients in the infirmary, and I need to be on hand in case of an emergency. I'm so glad I made it. Inoa jogged up to them. Oriana noticed she had a lovely purple duffel bag with her. Are you going on leave? Inoa smiled and held out the bag. No, dear, this is for you. Oriana took the handle. She held the bag awkwardly in front of her. Thank you. She set it on the floor and gave Inoa a big hug. We couldn't send you out into the world with nothing, Gemma said. Oriana spun around. You were both planning this? The two women laughed and pulled her into a group hug. Oriana clung to them. Thank you, both of you. I'm going to miss you so much. They released each other. Gemma said, Your tablet is in there, and I've saved the communication codes for Inoa, Joseph, Lieutenant Casmi, and me. We also saved some text and videos on chips that we thought you would find interesting, Inoa said. And there's some clothing we had printed for you, Gemma said. You can't go about in those basic grays, Inoa said. Oriana rubbed her eyes to stop the tears that were threatening. Hey! Joseph yelled from the other end of the shuttle bay. He dodged around other people while he jogged towards them. A gray duffel hung over his uniformed shoulder. He skid to a stop next to the women, then leaned forward and braced his hands on bent knees as he sucked in breath. You made it! I thought you might have changed your mind, Oriana said. He stood up straight. Of course, I wouldn't have abandoned you to a strange planet by yourself. Chief just kept me longer than I expected, so I ran to make sure I'd be on the same shuttle. A shuttle pilot approached the little group. Her flight suit fit closely to her body and was marked with silver stripes. Doctor, counselor, she greeted them with a nod for each. We're ready to depart. You made it just in time, Ensign. She turned to Joseph and Oriana. I have to ask you two to board now. Oriana's chest tightened and tears threatened again to break free. Gemma pulled her into another hug. You're going to be fine, Oriana. You are much stronger than you realize. And this isn't goodbye. It's only until later. She let go and stepped back. Inoa stepped up to hug her. Gemma is right, and if you need to talk, don't hesitate to write to me. Joseph lifted Oriana's bag over his other shoulder, and he took her hand. I'll make sure she gets settled here. Oh, take this. Inoa held out a thin card of about 3 inches long and an inch wide. A gold chip was set in one end and a very thin screen at the other. Are you familiar with how a credit chip works? Yes, at least I've read about them. Oriana took the chip. She saw that her name was printed on the card along with a series of numbers and letters. Since you don't have one implanted yet, we had this one made and keyed to your thumbprint, Gemma said. We've both added some funds to get you started. There were a number of other people who added funds for you too. You've made quite an impression. Oriana ran her thumb over the screen and a number displayed on it. She gasped and looked up at Emma. This is too much. Please take it back. She held it out to Inoa. No, Oriana, you'll need this. Inoa gently pushed her hand back. We don't know when you'll have an income of your own. Everyone only gave what they could afford, and they did it out of love and kindness. Keep it. You have to go now, Gemma said. Until we meet again. Farewell. Farewell, Oriana, Inoa said. Joseph started walking toward the shuttle and, since he had her hand, Oriana had to walk with him. The pilot followed them up the ramp. Oriana stopped just inside the door and looked back. Gemma and Inoa stood close together with an arm around each other's waist. Oriana gave them a little wave as the ramp was retracted and the door slid shut. Please find seats. We'll be departing shortly. The pilot walked down the aisle between the rows of seats and went through a door at the front of the compartment. Joseph led Oriana down the row of seats to a pair of empty ones. He stuffed the duffel bags under the seats and waited for her to sit before he sat in the aisle seat. She watched him fasten the safety harness and copied his actions. Once they were both secure, Joseph took her hand again and smiled down at her. It's going to be okay, he said. The pilot's voice filled the compartment. This is your pilot. We'll be launching in 30 seconds. Check your duffels and safety harnesses. The floor vibrated under Oriana's feet, and she clenched Joseph's hand as her stomach was pulled down with the lift of the shuttle. Then her stomach settled back into place and she relaxed. She looked around the shuttle at the other people. There was a rainbow of colored stripes on the uniforms she saw. The men and women were talking with such excitement. She looked past the man on her right, who was sitting with his eyes closed. The curved gray wall beyond him had a slight sheen to it. She wondered what sort of material it was. She turned back to Joseph, but just as she opened her mouth to ask, the pilot's voice came over the speakers again. Beginning descent. Everyone stopped talking. Oriana was grateful for the tight harness that kept her in place even as the force threatened to pull her out of the seat. The air grew warmer. Her heart was trying to escape her chest. She looked up at Joseph. He squeezed her hand and smiled. The man on her right hadn't even opened his eyes. The pressure released. She was thrown back against the seat. The air cooled. She took a deep breath. "You get used to it," Joseph said. "I don't see how." Oriana stood in the sun. She held out her arms, closed her eyes, and lifted her face to the sky. The breeze lifted loose strands of hair and danced over her skin. She opened her eyes. Joseph was standing in front of her with their duffel bags slung over each shoulder. He was watching her. "I didn't think I would miss being outdoors this much," she breathed in deeply. The air smelled strongly of machines and their lubricants, but there was also the smell of plants and pollen, as well as a strange scent she didn't know. She turned slowly in place. In front of her, the crew walked towards a collection of buildings of many heights and shapes with colorful rooftops. In the other directions, the hard surface of the landing area stretched in the distance to a stone wall of about 10 feet high. The shuttles had landed near each other, but they weren't the only vessels parked there. Several other shuttles were parked in a row to one side. There were also many other vehicles, from little 2-passenger hover cars to vehicles large enough to contain 2 shuttles. The wall at the far end was broken by a wide metal gate that currently stood open. Her eyes came back to Joseph, who was still watching her. "What is this place?" she asked. "We're on the Izanagi Fleet Base. The fleet members stationed here provide protection to the planet. We also help if there's some kind of natural disaster or stuff like that. I've been here before. It's a peaceful place, so everyone's pretty laid back." He took her hand and started walking towards the buildings. "You're supposed to see the base commander first. We'll start there." The nearest buildings were huge and had doors wide enough to accommodate even the largest vehicles. One of those was open, and Oriana could see people doing repairs to several vehicles. Others had large open doors so she could see stacks of containers within. A long, low building with a green roof had all its doors propped open, letting the smells of cooking food drift out onto the air. Joseph pointed to it. "There's the mess." He pointed at another green-roofed building across from there. "That's where we go to get stuff we need, like uniforms and whatnot. Over there is the commissary, where we can spend credits to get stuff like snacks and personal things. Past these buildings, you can just see the yellow roofs. Those are all the barracks. We can bunk there while on leave, and it doesn't cost us anything, or we can stay in hotels if we want to spend credits. I prefer the hotels." He pointed out the blue-roofed infirmary and the black-roofed officers' quarters and offices. "That's where we're headed." The commander himself didn't see them. His secretary handed a manila yellow packet to Oriana. "This is the paperwork you'll need to register as a Union citizen. You can do it at the administration in the city. Good luck to you, miss." He went back to his work. Oriana looked up at Joseph, who mouthed, "I'm sorry." Then he took her hand and led her back outside. "Don't worry about a thing. I'll make sure you're all set before I have to go back to the ship." "But paperwork? Why paper?" He shrugged. "Bureaucrats still like their paper, I guess." "Isn't that more expensive than using a chip?" "Probably." They continued through the base and left through a large metal gate. A bus sat on the pavement with its doors open. Some of the crew from Chicago were already seated on board, and a few more were boarding as Joseph and Oriana approached. "The bus will take us downtown, and we can walk everywhere else we want to go. If we wanted to go somewhere outside the city, we could rent a car." He waited while she climbed the steps into the bus, then followed behind her. She slid into an empty seat. Joseph handed her bag to her, then sat with his on the floor between his legs. She copied him, then looked out the window at the scenery across from the base. Her mouth dropped open at the sight of the vast blue-white expanse of water before her. The water lapped against rocks not more than 100 feet away. It went on forever into the distance. Birds wheeled about the sky above and dropped down occasionally to snatch a fish from the water before gliding to the rocks with their prize. The smell coming off of the sea was the one she hadn't been able to identify before. "Is it an ocean?" she asked. Joseph glanced out the window. "Sort of. It's a bay that lets out into the ocean." "I've never seen anything like it before." "Well, on vids, but that's not like this." She closed her eyes and listened to the calls of the birds, breathed in the scent of the water. "It's wonderful." She opened her eyes again and found Joseph looking at her. "I guess it really is." He shifted closer to her and put his arm over her shoulders so he could look out the window with her. The bus doors snapped shut and the floor vibrated as the anti-grav thrusters pushed the vehicle up off the ground. It glided forward with a barely audible whine from the electric engine. The bus carried them through a rocky, scrub-covered landscape. After a while, it turned away from the bay, and soon they were driving through a dense community of homes and businesses. The buildings were mostly 1 or 2 stories, though a few rose as tall as 5 or 6. Then ahead of them, glistening towers reached towards the clouds. Oriana sat up as tall as she could to see over the other seats and past passengers to look through the front window of the bus. The city seemed to rise up around them as they passed between taller and taller buildings until they were surrounded by structures of such height that they blocked out the sky. People rushed about on sidewalks. They were like a patch of many different wildflowers with their rainbow of different types of clothing. There were also cars of many different kinds and nearly as many colors hovering about or parked along the road. She turned to look at the shining windows of the shops they passed. They displayed many different sorts of colorful and amazing things. In one window, a bright red satiny dress on a mannequin caught her eye. She tried to make mental note of all that she was seeing, but there was too much. The bus came to a stop and settled to the ground. The doors opened and the passengers rose to leave, so Oriana did too. Joseph lifted their bags again, and she followed him out of the bus. She watched the bus lift off the ground and glide away. The Chicago's crew headed off in every direction, leaving them standing on the sidewalk. Oriana studied the buildings around her. There was a small shelter at the edge of the sidewalk by the road with a fleet symbol etched in the glass. "It's a bus stop for us. The bus comes by a half-dozen times a day or so. We can always wait there for a ride back to the base." He adjusted the bags on his shoulders. "We should get you registered as a citizen before we do anything else. That way no one will give you any trouble." He took her hand and pulled her into the stream of people walking along the sidewalk. The administration office was organized chaos. As they entered, people went into one of several cattle lines between black ropes to approach a long counter with people standing behind it at equally spaced computers. Some people were then directed to chairs at the left or right end of the room. Others went to different lines. Names were called and people went through doors along the wall to the left or right of the counter. A low roar of constant conversation and the odors of the many people were overwhelming even just inside the door. The cheap lighting gave a yellow cast to everything, and it was too warm. Oriana wanted to go back through the door, but Joseph held on to her hand, preventing her from running away. A man was standing to the left of the door with a tablet in his hand. His hair was neatly trimmed and his slacks and shirt well fitted. Sweat rings were visible under his arms, and his chin was covered in a fresh growth of prickly-looking hair. "What's your purpose?" the man asked. "Citizen registration," Joseph said. The man looked up from his tablet for the first time. He took in Joseph's uniform and then looked down his thick nose at Oriana. He returned his eyes to the tablet and jabbed the screen with his finger. "Take her down the blue hall to office 12. He gestured for them to go around the cattle lines to the left. "Thank you," Joseph said as he led Oriana through the crowd and through the blue door. The hallway was cooler and offered relief from the odors and noise, but was still awash in the yellowish lighting. It was lined with many numbered doors on their right. "Why didn't we have to wait in line?" Oriana asked. "It's because of my uniform. They give priority to us because we can be called back to the base at any time. And, well, we're pledged to risk our lives for them, so..." He shrugged. "Oh." They came to the door with a number 12 on it. Joseph knocked once, then opened the door and let Oriana enter ahead of him. A woman sat behind a counter that cut the room in half. There was another door behind her. 2 chairs sat on this side of the counter. A computer monitor with keyboard and a cube-shaped device were all that was on top of the counter. "Have a seat," the woman said. Her blonde hair was pulled up on top of her head in a messy bun, and her face was painted with makeup that was garish to look at. Her rings, earrings, and necklace all sported jewels that matched her turquoise blouse. Her long nails were painted the same color. Oriana noticed that the roots of her hair were brown. Joseph and Oriana sat down, and she handed the woman the packet that she had received at the base. The woman grimaced at it, but she opened it and pulled out the papers. She looked over each page, then started typing on the keyboard. She glanced at the papers occasionally, but didn't look up at the people across from her. Oriana looked at Joseph, who smiled at her and reached over to pat her hands, which were folded on her lap. The woman stopped typing and opened a drawer, then pulled out an object that reminded Oriana of a stylus, though it was thicker and had a button on the side. The cube-shaped machine made a whirring sound, and a chip, smaller than Oriana's pinky fingernail, slid out onto a tray in front of the machine. The woman opened one end of the stylus and used a tweezers to place the tiny chip inside. She clicked it closed and held out her hand. "Give me your left hand," she said, as she looked up at Oriana for the first time since they had entered. Oriana looked at Joseph. "It's okay. I understand it only hurts for a second," he said. "I had mine implanted when I was a baby, though, so I don't remember it." Oriana shifted to the edge of her chair and leaned forward to stretch her left hand over the desk. The woman grabbed her hand and flipped it over palm up. She pressed the stylus tip to the fleshy part between her thumb and forefinger and pushed the button on the side of the device. Oriana yelped as sharp pain startled her. She fought back the threatening tears. If a baby could do this, then surely she could. The woman took away the device and studied Oriana's hand. Then she took out a device that looked like a small tablet and held it over Oriana's hand, and it beeped. She released her hand and set the device on the desk. "You're a citizen of the Union now," the woman said as she swept the papers off the desk into a trash can and put the devices back in the drawer. Joseph stood up. Oriana stared down at the red spot on her hand. It was too small of a spot for the pain it had caused. The woman stared at her, so she stood up and followed Joseph into the hall. Once the door was closed, he took her left hand in both of his and planted a gentle kiss on the red spot. "I'm sorry. I should have warned you about the way some people look down on isolationists. They don't understand why anyone would choose to be separate from the Union, so they make their own judgments." "It isn't your fault. You aren't one of those people." Joseph took her right hand and led her back through the building to the street. "What do you want to do first?" he asked. "I'm kind of hungry. Could we get something to eat?" Joseph grinned. "You bet. I'm starved." They walked hand in hand along the sidewalk, looking into shop windows and admiring the fine things displayed for sale. Joseph led her to a coffee house on a corner that had a seating area in front. They ate sandwiches and drank coffee while watching the people walk by. Oriana wondered where all these people were rushing off to. Many of them were in such a hurry to get where they were going that they never looked around themselves. She studied the signs at the street corner, the businesses all around, and the way the buildings stretched high up into the sky as if reaching for the clouds. She considered that she would never have come to this place if not for the attack on her home, the deaths of so many, but she was here, and she knew that she had to make the best of it. They wandered the city for several hours after that and stopped in a few shops where Joseph made purchases while Oriana browsed. They stopped into a restaurant called Sea Star, where he treated her to a dinner of fresh seafood. Oriana marveled at the huge crustaceans they were served, and she delighted in learning how to crack their shells to get at the soft meat inside. Back on the sidewalk, sunbeams lanced across the ground between the buildings as the sun moved lower in the sky. Lights winked on in the buildings and along the streets as shadows stretched and the air cooled. Oriana shivered when a cool breeze blew over her skin, but she smiled at the sensation. Joseph looked down at her. "It's getting chilly, huh? I forgot how fast it cools off here at night. Let's go get a suite at a nice hotel." "Okay. was what Oriana said, but she was thinking that staying in the same place as Joseph would be so scandalous back home. What would her father have thought? Oriana stood on the sidewalk with her face tilted skyward, trying to see where the Colonial Hotel and Spa ended. She couldn't see the top level, even if she leaned back. The two men at the entrance looked like they had stepped out of another time. Their black uniforms and hats reminded Oriana of images she had seen of doormen in front of hotels on Earth in the 20th century. The men tipped their hats as she and Joseph passed through the automatic doors. Her eyes were dazzled in the light from the glittering gold and crystal chandeliers in the lobby. The marble floor glowed with the reflected light. People dressed as diversely as those on the street lounged on various plush chairs and couches placed about the wide room. Several young women in short black dresses served glasses of wine from trays. Through wide double doors to the left, Oriana could see into the dining room. The sounds of silverware clanking on dishes carried into the lobby, as well as soft music played by a pianist somewhere within. To the right, a young couple stood in front of the mahogany reception desk. Several blue and yellow suitcases were stacked beside them. A bellhop in a red jacket and hat came forward from the row of bellhops standing against the wall. He gathered their bags, and the couple followed him to the elevators. The man behind the counter was dressed in a gray suit with a wine-colored tie. He smiled as Oriana and Joseph approached the counter, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome to the Colonial. Do you have a reservation?" "No, we don't. I'm on leave. Let's start with 2 nights." Joseph set down the duffel bags and held out his left hand. "I have a nice single on the 4th floor. We'll have one of the suites," Joseph said. The man held a small tablet device over Joseph's hand until a long tone sounded. He tapped on the screen with a stylus, paused with the stylus poised in the air. Then he looked up at Joseph and said, "Apologies, sir. We have a suite available on the 21st floor. Would that be acceptable?" "Yes, it will be. Thank you." The man tapped a few more things on the tablet before he set it down. A bellhop came forward and picked up the duffel bags. The man behind the counter handed a pair of key cards to the bellhop. "If you'll please follow me, sir, ma'am." The bellhop started walking towards the elevators. The golden elevator doors were brightly polished, and it was like standing before a full-length mirror. Oriana had a look at herself for the first time in a while, and she inwardly cringed at her curves in the baggy gray clothes from the ship. One of the elevators slid open, and the bellhop stood aside for them to enter first. He followed and pressed the button labeled 21. Their footsteps were silent on the thick carpet of the elevator's floor. Soft music played from speakers hidden somewhere overhead. Oriana watched the numbers climb until the doors slid open again. The hallway was carpeted with the same wine and gold carpet as the elevator. A dark gold color covered the walls, and the soft lighting reminded Oriana of twilight. They passed just a couple of doors before stopping in front of one that the bellhop opened. He set the bags inside the door and handed the key cards to Joseph. "Enjoy your stay, sir." He shut the door behind him as he left the room. Oriana stood looking at the main room of the suite. A large vid screen hung on the wall to the right, with a velvety white couch and chairs arranged in front of it. To the left, a small white dining table had 4 chairs arranged around it. The floor was covered in light gray carpet, and heavy drapes were pulled back from the wide windows looking out over the city. A door to each side stood open to bedrooms with large beds and more white furniture. She picked up her duffel bag and walked towards the door on the left. Joseph was watching her. She placed the duffel on the bed and looked around at the matching wardrobe, dresser, and dressing table. Another door opened to a bathroom with a big tub and shower. The fixtures glimmered white and silver. She turned around and went back into the main room. "This is so fancy. It must be very expensive." Joseph laughed and shook his head. "Don't worry about it. I've got it covered." He gestured to the bedroom. "Go ahead and get comfortable. Unpack. I'll get settled in the other room." Oriana went back into the bedroom and dumped the contents of the duffel bag on the bed. A rainbow of clothing spread out, as well as the tablet in a case. She opened the case and ran her finger along the rows of chips tucked into little pockets of the cover. After setting down the tablet, she lifted each piece of clothing, which she folded and stacked. There were even a pair of sandals and walking shoes. She took her time showering, then dressed in a sleeveless sea green blouse and loose skirt. She placed the walking shoes on the floor by the door and laid out the powder blue nightgown on the bed. Then she packed the rest of the clothing and the tablet back into the bag, which she set on the floor beside the shoes. When she came out to the main room, Joseph was sitting on the couch with his back to her. He stood up and looked at her with an intensity she had never seen before. She dropped her eyes to the floor as she felt her face grow hot. "Hey now, sweetheart." He walked over and stood in front of her. "Still getting embarrassed around me?" He gently lifted her chin so she had to look up at him. "It's just, nobody ever looked at me like that, and Was somebody mean to you before? They must have been an idiot to make you feel like that. You are beautiful in every way. There's no reason to be embarrassed with me. I will never judge you." He had already moved his finger from below her chin, but she was still looking up at him. He leaned forward, bit by bit. She felt her heart thumping hard against her ribs. She couldn't move. She closed her eyes. His lips brushed against hers. Then he was gone again. She opened her eyes, and he stood there looking down at her. She didn't know what to make of his expression. He gently stroked her bare arms and closed his eyes briefly. Then he took a deep breath and let it out very slowly. He took 2 steps back from her and opened his eyes. She stayed still. "Come see what I ordered from room service," he said. Then he turned and walked back to the couch. Oriana touched her lips with her fingertips as he turned away. Then she followed him over. A tray from room service sat on the coffee table. 2 bowls of vanilla ice cream and a bowl of strawberries and syrup stood on the tray. He patted the couch next to him, so she sat and watched as he spooned the syrup and berries over the ice cream in one of the bowls, then slipped a spoon into it and handed it to her. Then he did the same with the other bowl and sat back on the couch. She ate the ice cream slowly. It was a rare treat back home, and this was more flavorful than anything she'd had before. Vanilla was a plant they couldn't grow. She'd never had it before. More than once she glanced up and thought she saw Joseph turn away quickly. She was sure he was watching her and trying to pretend he wasn't. It wasn't hard to imagine what he might want. She knew what men and women did together, but he wasn't trying. She smiled to herself. When the ice cream was gone, she stood up and walked over to the bedroom. "Good night, Joseph," she said while looking back over her shoulder. She went into the room and closed the door behind her. She leaned against the door for a moment before changing into the nightgown, draped her clothes over the dressing table chair, then climbed into bed. The sun shining through her bedroom window woke Oriana in the morning. She stretched, rolled out of bed, and got ready for the day. Since the clothing had only been used for such a short time, she pulled on the same top and skirt from the night before, as well as the sandals. Joseph was lounging on the couch, watching the morning news on the vid screen when she came out of the room. He turned around and grinned at her. She resisted the urge to look at the floor and smiled back at him instead. "I figured we'd do breakfast in the dining room, then we can go see more of the city. What do you think?" "That sounds good." "Great." He stood up and headed for the door. "Do you have a jacket? It could get chilly out there." "Oh yeah, I'll go get it." Oriana hurried back into her room, found the jacket in the duffel bag, and came back. "Let's go." The dining room was full at this hour, but they only waited a few minutes before being seated at a small round table. Since her usual breakfast was available, it didn't take long for Oriana to decide what she wanted. Joseph ordered steak and eggs. While they ate, Oriana looked around at the other people. There were many different styles of clothing and jewelry, and the people were all different too. Different hair, skin, eyes. The people of the colony had all been so similar. "You look confused," Joseph said. Oriana's head snapped around to face him. "I'm sorry, it's just so different." "I would guess so, since you're from a farming colony." "What did they all do?" He laughed. Well, a lot of things. Some of these people are guests of the hotel on holiday. Others just like eating here. Those folks are probably bigwigs wherever they work. It's a pricey restaurant to just come in to eat. What do you mean, bigwigs? Oh, people in charge, like CEOs and stuff like that. Oriana turned that over in her head. She knew that CEO meant Chief Executive Officer of a company. It wasn't the first time she considered just how wealthy Joseph must be. She wondered if any of those credits on the little chip had come from him. It would be rude to ask. When they'd finished eating, Joseph took her hand and they left the hotel. He led her down the street to a public bus stop. I imagine you'll be using the bus quite a bit, so I thought we'd use them today so you can get the hang of it. As they boarded the bus, he demonstrated scanning his hand for the fare. The bus didn't have a human driver. It was computer controlled. In the seat, he showed her how the screen on the back of the seat in front of them would show the stops and what was around them. He dragged the map around and found the place he wanted to go, then tapped the bus stop to tell the computer that was where they wanted to get off. He explained that the route could adjust based on whether there were people waiting at a stop or people that wanted to get off at one. As they passed by businesses and streets, Joseph pointed out more of the places she should know. Oriana was grateful for her good memory. It was a lot to keep track of. When they left the bus, it was in a neighborhood of row houses. This is a good neighborhood where you can rent a room from some nice folks. Joseph led her along the sidewalk and pointed off to his left where she could just make out some taller buildings, including a big dome. This is close to the university, so a lot of people staying here are students that don't live on campus. He pointed to signs declaring rooms available. See that sign there? This one only rents out to girls. You want someplace like that. It's run by a lady, and you'll be safer and looked after more. I'd feel better knowing you're someplace like this. He paused and looked down at her. In fact, let's go check it out. Wait! Huh? Why? I know you want to look out for me, but I'm not ready for that, okay? He looked down at her for a moment. Okay, but don't forget about this area. I won't forget. She stretched up on her toes and kissed his cheek. He had such a goofy grin on his face, she started laughing. They spent the rest of the day walking around the city, visiting shops and restaurants and riding the bus or self-driving cabs. Every time they went somewhere new, Joseph demonstrated how things worked. Oriana stored the little bits of information away in her memory for the inevitable time that she'd be left alone, but she kept that thought carefully locked up. When they returned to the hotel, Joseph sent her up to the suite while he went to call the base to check in. She was watching a documentary on the vid screen when he came in. You look so serious, she said. You have to go soon. Yes, the repairs are going very quickly, and they'll be ready to leave tomorrow afternoon. I'm expected to report in the morning. He came to sit by her on the couch. He leaned against the armrest and guided her to lean against his chest, then kissed the top of her head. Oriana relaxed in his embrace and breathed in his scent. Maybe I could sneak you back onto the ship, he said. I would just end up dropped off somewhere else when they found me, and you'd be in trouble too. This planet seems nice. I'll be okay. He squeezed her tighter and rested his cheek on top of her head. I could go AWOL. That would be very bad, wouldn't it? Only if they caught me. What would happen? Jail, probably. She pulled out of his arms and twisted around to look at him. No, that wouldn't help me either. No, I suppose not. He brushed his fingertips along her cheek. She closed her eyes and tilted her head towards his hand. He cupped her cheek and she felt his breath before his lips touched hers. She kissed him back. He sat back and she opened her eyes. We had better go to our beds, Oriana. Good night, sweetheart. He stood up, then walked into his room and shut the door. Oriana sat there for a moment before going to her own bed.